This chapter will discuss social reform and how we can better understand social policy and the structure of American welfare state. During World War II, the changes in domestic policy were mostly avoided. Only the GI Bill was enacted. Since military spending decreased after the war, federal government wanted to obtain full employment and order spending of social programs such as health insurance, housing, and expanded Social Security. They wanted to prevent the reoccurrence of another Great Depression. The real diversion of resources and presidential effort from domestic issues to military spending and international affairs started in 1950. Yes, the Cold War. Military spending is far more today than in the early 1950s, but Americans spent about 68% of their national budget in the 1950s on military and related spending. Military spending was excessive. Eisenhower, the World War II's hero, had no interest in expanding social spending aside from small programs here and there. He constantly sought to cut the defense budget, but the costly technological advances of 1950 left the large military budget that Truman initiated at the start of the Korean War to turn towards reform. President Kennedy made social reform a part of his campaign. He promised to help the elderly with their medical bills, to develop programs to help Americans living in poverty. Serious social problems existed. Mostly obvious in the South, where millions of African Americans, Latinos, and First Americans experienced poverty and violations of their rights. Kennedy regarded the New Deal reforms, which provided economic resources and jobs to the poor. The Civil Rights Movement pushed Kennedy and the nation towards social reform. In 1963, Kennedy proposed his own civil rights legislation, which prohibited job discrimination on the basis of race and gender, as well as discrimination in voter registration. He was unable to secure passage of most of his major social legislation, but he established a policy agenda for his successor, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson had a fatal personal flaw: policy gluttony. He wanted to be the most successful domestic and international president in American history. His biggest mistake was the tax cut of 1964. He promised not to increase national budget until tax revenues returned to their former pre-cut levels. Liberals complained that his great society was poorly funded because too many resources went to the Vietnam conflict. He went all out in creating domestic reforms. He secured the enactment of domestic measures that greatly expanded the role of the federal government in social policy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a historic measure. It marked the first time since Reconstruction that the federal government had assumed a major role in protecting the voting rights of African Americans in the South. Johnson didn't plan on introducing the Civil Rights Act of 1965. He was confronted with massive civil rights protests for the continuing denial of suffrage to African Americans in the South. It gave the federal government the right to presume discrimination in any state or its subdivisions where less than 50% of people of color voted in federal elections and in areas that used literacy or other screening tests. Johnson and Wilbur Mills, a powerful chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, facilitated the passage of Medicare and Medicaid programs. Medicare helped elderly persons to pay their medical bills, and Medicaid addressed the medical needs of welfare recipients and poor persons who couldn't pay their medical bills. The welfare reform of 1967. People that fled rural areas and found job prospects in urban areas were strengthened by civil rights protests to claim their right to aid to families with dependent children, AFDC. By the late 1960s, women realized that receipt of AFDC entitled them to receive Medicaid, food stamps, daycare, and work-related incentive programs. Johnson has succeeded in enacting domestic reforms despite his failed decisions. The civil rights struggles of African Americans motivated women, Latinos, gay men, lesbians, Asian Americans, and First Americans to engage in policy advocacy. Each group developed reformist leaders and engaged in different forms of protest. Social work in the 1960s came from the Great Depression with certainty to upgrade the profession by making a bachelor's degree mandatory for admission to graduate programs. Social work members were involved in mental health, child welfare, and public welfare agencies. What can be learned about the Great Society about the structure of the American welfare state? 3 major additions were made to the American welfare state: civil rights legislation, federal programs, and new entitlements. All of these aided in the modern American welfare state.
Created using Powtoon.